So it's actually been a while since any of our older characters received a buff. They started doing this a couple months back, where they take a look at the lesser used characters to make some adjustments to their kit, and hopefully improve their performance so that players can actually use them. I can sort of understand why they haven't been doing this for the past couple of months, because I can only assume that they have been busy working with the big projects like the summer event, the NIKKE collaboration, and as well as the 1-year anniversary. Those events were not only fun, but they also came with a bunch of meta-defining characters that are now dominating the meta as we speak. 9 out of the 10 most recent trade-up units are actually all meta. And if you don't believe me, you can go ahead and check the top players' team compositions in the solo raids, and I can guarantee you that you will see these characters in their teams, with many of these units being a recurring member, regardless of what enemy is in the solo raids. I like getting strong characters as much as the other guy, but if we keep getting meta-defining characters this often, I just can't help but be concerned about the older characters that we have. Releasing a bunch of broken units, especially at this pace, can have a positive impact in some ways, but this can also have a very negative impact on the game, and that in itself can be a whole separate video. But for this one, I want to first talk about some of the characters that I think are actually very close to being meta. Well, maybe being meta is a stretch, but giving these characters a buff should at least make it so that players actually consider using them. I'm picking out the more popular characters because more players are going to be satisfied if they actually buff a character that many people want to use. On top of that, I'm also picking out characters that already have a really good foundation on their kit and also have some semblance of being a really good unit. So it only takes a few adjustments to eliminate the things that are holding them back from being a really good option for specific teams. And I want to put an emphasis on specific, because yes, I want these characters to be buffed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I want them to be as good as the best units that we have. If every single character in the game is very close in terms of power level, then that is going to defeat the purpose of team building. My ideal type of meta is one where we have a set of characters that are above the rest of the units, but the characters below them can still be considered as good options in some specific scenarios. A really good baseline for this is Agent D. She is by no means a broken unit, but she is also not bad. Agent D is a specialist that is really good against enemies that are weak towards wind type characters and enemies that have multiple breakable parts. She also has a unique ability that is going to let you enter full burst almost immediately after the battle starts, so that brings a lot of value in itself. She might not be broken, but at the very least, Agent D excels in specific types of content. But sadly, we can't say the same thing for a lot of the other characters in the game. So the first character I want to be buffed is Winter Shopper Rupee. She was the very first character variant in NIKKE, so that makes it even more sad that she actually turned out to be this bad. And I figured that since the winter event is just around the corner, it's actually going to be the perfect time to buff Winter Shopper Rupee. Because if they ever decide to rerun her banner, I can only imagine how bad her banner revenue is going to be, because not many people are going to pull for a below average unit. The problem with Winter Shopper Rupee is that she is basically a tank that has a very low survivability. Yes, she also buffs your allies, and the reload speed buff is actually pretty good, but all of her buffs don't matter if she's not able to survive on the field. Doubling the values on her defense increase is going to be really good, but not necessarily broken. The way how defense works in NIKKE is already kind of bad, so having a measly 1.33% defense increase per stack on her skill 2 and a 19.02% defense increase from her skill 1 is not really going to do much in terms of helping her team survive. I also wouldn't mind if her skill 1 gets changed from affecting all of her allies to only affecting herself, as long as they double the duration for the taunt effect on her burst, because that is going to significantly improve her ability to fill the role of a tank. If they feel like that is not enough, I think that giving her an HP potency buff on her skill 1 is going to be a really good addition to her kit. Next up, another character I want to be buffed is Isabel. The problem with Isabel is that she takes a very long time to stack all of her buffs, and even after she gets all of her stacks, her damage is still pretty bad compared to the other shotgun DPS that deal more damage right off the bat. The main thing I want them to change are the buffs on her skill 1. Take the 17.28% attack buff and put it on the first activation, and then get rid of both the critical rate and crit damage, and give her a team-wide burst gauge loading speed buff on her second activation. Critical buffs are just inferior to attack buffs, so she is not really going to lose significant damage if we get rid of that. Also, having the attack buff on the first activation is going to increase her damage even more compared to when she is getting the attack buff basically after 5 or 6 full burst rotations. And the reason why I want to give her a burst gauge loading speed buff is because I think that it actually fits her theme around being extremely fast, both in terms of the lore and how how her kit works. She is a NIKKE that is basically a fighter jet, and she has a very fast burst ability that is only going to last for 5 seconds. So having a burst gauge loading speed buff is going to fit her team very well, and it's also going to help her get all the stacks on her skill 1 even faster. As for the other buff, during the 3rd activation, they can honestly go with many different options, but the ones that I prefer is another attack buff or an attack speed buff. Of course, the attack buff is going to be really good as long as they give her a decent scaling. And at the same time, the attack speed buff is still going to be in line with their theme of being a really fast character. Honestly, I can actually see Isabel being one of the more fun characters to use if they actually end up buffing her to the point where she is at least a viable option as a DPS. Her 5-second burst can also be very useful for team compositions where you have a lot of characters that rely on using their burst to activate their buffs or to deal a significant portion of their damage. And then last, but certainly not the least, the character that I and thousands of other people have been asking to get buffed is Nihilister. Pretty much every single player's experience after getting Nihilister is perfectly summed up by one of the cons in Pridewend's review. Takes ages to unlock her, and when you finally get her, you are rewarded with disappointment. And if top tier design is being considered as a pro, then you know that there's definitely something wrong with this character. But before we talk about the Nihilister buffs that I want to happen, let's first debunk the notion of some players saying that Nihilister being weak is lore accurate. Specifically because of what happened after chapter 20 stage 31. Of course, I'm not going to spoil it just in case you haven't seen it yet, but basically something happens resulting in Nihilister not being as strong as she was. But the thing about characters being lore accurate in terms of power level is actually a bit too late for NIKKE. You can't and you shouldn't be cherry picking which characters are lore accurate and which ones are not. If you want every single character's power level to be lore accurate, then the bunnies, Naga, Tia, Litter, Senti, and many other units shouldn't be as good as they are right now. So Nihilister being a bottom tier character is purely just a coincidence, not unless we get an official confirmation saying that they actually made her weak because of the story. But regardless, let's actually talk about how I want her to get buffed. The problem with Nihilister is that she is a DPS character, but her kit doesn't support that role. Her burst is practically useless, or at least lackluster compared to the other damage dealing burst 2 abilities, and she also has zero utility outside of her pierce attacks. Some DPS or attacker units can get away with not dealing as much damage because they provide a pretty good damage buff to your main damage dealers, and in some cases, your whole team. But for Nihilister, yes, they can go for that route, but I think a lot of people actually want her to be a viable burst 2 DPS, just like Guilty. For the changes I want to happen, I would love to see them make her burst hit all the enemies, instead of just the enemies within the attack range. And if not, then at least double the size of the effective radius on the attack. Because when I think of Nihilister, I think of the word big. Nihilister's weapons are big. Nihilister's charge attacks are big. Her milkers, I don't see why they gave Nihilister a teeny tiny burst AoE in the first place. One more thing is that I want them to change her skill 2 from activates every 10 seconds to activates every time Nihilister attacks with burning shot active. This is going to increase her damage while also keeping true with her big AoE and fully charged attack playstyle. And I know that for some people, these adjustments are not enough, so honestly, just double her values, at least for the initial damage of her burst, and also increase the scaling on her skill too. She is not really going to power creep anyone, because ultimately, she is going to be more of a DPS that excels in stages with high enemy density. There's a ton of other characters that also desperately need a buff, so hopefully they get back to working on the older characters, so that we have more viable options for different team compositions.